In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan sits down with Chuck Morris, a legendary music promoter, manager, chairman, Emeritus, and former CEO of AEG Presents Rocky Mountains, who helped shape the modern music industry. From booking bands at the Sink in Boulder to managing the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band for 25 years, Chuck has worked with icons like Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, Elton John, U2, and Bruce Springsteen. He shares stories from introducing U2 to Red Rocks, convincing Springsteen to play there for his first outdoor concert, and bringing American music to the Soviet Union with Phil Anschutz. Chuck also dives into Boulder's golden era of music, the rise and fall of Caribou Ranch, and how he built a career discovering bands with undeniable magic. Now Chuck is focused on the next generation of the music industry, leading Colorado State University's music business program and shaping the future of artists and executives alike. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
Well, Chuck, I'm excited about this.
Thank you so much for letting me do this. I'm flattered.
So I have this friend, his name's Mark Everett, friend from high school, but he lives out here and he's into the music scene. And he said he had a complaint about my podcast.
What was the complaint?
He said, you don't have anyone on your podcast that has a music background. You need to get some kind of music person on your podcast. And I said, you know what? I got someone coming up. He said, who? I'm like, his name's Chuck. You'll have to wait until we get there before you know the rest of the story, because it's a hell of a story that we're going to go through. And we're going to go through it in a journey because, it's going to bounce around a lot. As we were talking about, this is free flowing. And then maybe one other call out before we get started, and that is your daughter actually kind of suggested that we reach out to you.
Oh, Brittany.
Brittany. So
yeah,
thank you, Brittany. This is for you too.
I'm proud of all my kids. She's my oldest of 5.
Yeah.
So proud of what she's doing.
Yeah. No, we've worked together with her a bit. And
my second daughter is Colby Morris, who's now a rabbi.
Oh, really?
Steamboat Springs, which
wow.
I've never been a great Jew, and I'm so proud of her, but I don't know how that happened. But she's the rabbi, and she was in the music school at CU, great singer, was in a bunch of bands, could have probably made it in my business. And then she started dating her future husband, who's a second generation Israeli. They met at JCC Ranch Camp. Mm-hmm. And she decided to become a rabbi, went to the rabbinical school in Jerusalem for 5 years, her and her little kids, so they all speak Hebrew fluently, and she's now the rabbi in Steamboat.
Yeah, one thing you learn as you get older is your kids find their own journeys. You can help shape them, you can help expose them to things, but they're going to be who they're going to be. And
and I learned a long time ago they have to follow their heart, what they really want. I don't care if they want to be a truck driver. I mean, whatever they
I got a lot of truck drivers as fans.
Oh, I'm not saying that in a bad way at all. So do I. But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They have to, they have to follow their own dreams.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt. So Boulder itself has a crazy music history.
Absolutely. And I've been blessed
maybe
to be
let's start
part
there.
of it.
Yeah, you're a big part of it, but let's describe what is like when people think of Boulder in the earlier kind of 70s rock era. Well, what was the scene here? Why was this significant?
Boulder was, I came out to Boulder to see you to go to graduate school.
Yep.
I was a very good student, grew up in Brooklyn and in Queens, graduated from high school at 16 and Queens College at 20. And CU gave me a partial scholarship to come out to get a PhD in political science. Mm. And because I love politics, I still have done a lot of political benefits. So sort of combining music and politics. And went to CU. I was a TA at 21, teaching Poli-Sci 100, going for a doctorate. And then one day I decided that I love music more than getting a PhD and doing something in the political world. And so I dropped out.
So, let's talk about that. So when you say you discovered you loved music so much you were going to drop out, what does that really mean? Like when you, what was it you discovered about yourself and about your love for music?
I'll tell you what the first thing that got me excited. My dad was a school teacher and then a principal and was a camp counselor. And we would go up, the whole family, wherever camp he was a camp counselor in. And for 14 years, we went up to Lake Chautauqua, New York, where he was, and I, spent 12 summers there. And Lake Chautauqua is a very famous place that has they have a symphony, they have an opera, they have concerts, everything. And When I was about 11 years old at the amphitheater in Lake Chautauqua, I saw the Kingston Trio.
Oh, wow.
And I watched them.
Well, for the people viewing, tell us about the Kingston Trio.
Kingston Trio was one of the big folk acts in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Very, very big. And I saw them as a young kid and fell in love with them and folk music. And started buying every album I could of every folk band, and going from Bob Dylan to the Kingston Trio to the Weavers to Pete Seeger and the.
Did you see the Bob Dylan movie that just came out recently?
Oh yeah, and I've done
Pete
a lot
Seeger
of Dylan dates.
Did that bring back memories for you?
Absolutely, and I've done a lot of Dylan dates. Although, God bless Bob Dylan, he is such a recluse. I've probably done 35 dates with him, and he's so reclusive. He usually hides on his bus, runs on stage, and leaves. And even though I've done him and I'm best friends with his manager, he still barely knows who I am. Sometimes he'll walk by me at a show that I'm promoting, and I get the idea in his eyes is, I think I know that guy, but I'm not sure who he is. Because Bob, God bless him, he's such a recluse that that's just Bob Dylan. I thought that movie was great.
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic. I mean, I don't know if I should say this or not because it'll kind of destroy my image a little bit, but I was there with my wife and with another couple, and the movie's ending, the credits are coming out, the lights are going up, people are getting up to leave. I sat there another 5 minutes, and I got to confess, I had tears in my eyes. It was like, I knew Bob Dylan. I love his music, but I grew up, after, the height of the Bob Dylan era. So I never experienced him in that way, and to experience that.
Myself and Barry Fay did the Rolling Thunder Review in Fort Collins, Colorado at CSU years ago. Oh, yeah. Which was the toughest show I ever promoted. It rained like crazy. It got stopped 14 times at the old stadium in Fort Collins, 1975, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about the Rolling Thunder.
Well, that was the tour that Dylan did that year. Him and a bunch of guests, friends, Roger McGuinn from the Byrds, and Joni Mitchell played on some dates, and he had all of his friends play. Yeah. And I did with Barry Fay, who I was the main promoter for under him. And we did the one in Fort Collins, which was the biggest rainstorm I ever saw in my life. It rained for like 36 hours, 12 hours before, and it poured during the show. I didn't think we'd get through the show. We had to stop it about 14 times. Of course, it became a big DVD, and it was an NBC special called The Hard Rain.
Wow.
And it was, it became a legendary show at the old stadium in Fort Collins. And it's a show that I was working with Faye on, and we promoted that. And I'll tell you, it was really interesting. After that show was the toughest show physically I ever promoted, all the thousands of shows. I never thought we'd get through it. And Bob Dylan got through it. He would not give up. And I'll never forget, a month or two later, he had taped all the Rolling Thunder tours or dates. And he used that as the main show that he made a DVD on. And it was an NBC special. And I was thinking, why would Bob Dylan do that? We had to stop the show. We almost lost it. We had all sorts of technical problems. And my only thought about Bob was, and again, I don't mean to try to figure out what Bob Dylan thinks, but
it's kind of complicated in his head. Oh
God, yeah. And I'm the biggest fan, don't get me wrong. But I always thought what he did was, I got through that, and people stayed around with the biggest rainstorm ever, and nobody left. If my fans did that, I'd like the other fans to see that. That's why I think he picked that as the big show for the Rolling Thunder Review.
Absolutely.
That's my guess on Bob. And again, I promoted Bob for years and don't know him very well at all.
Yeah. What about Pete Seeger? Did you spend any time with Pete Seeger? And why?
Yeah, I did.
Pete Seeger was like a legend.
The Weavers were one of the early shows. I went to his band.
Yeah.
He was a legendary guy. I was an old folkie.
And what made him legendary? Obviously, we know some of his most marquee
Pete Seeger
songs, but what made him?
He's had some of the greatest songs, and my memories escape me. But
I love the Bruce Springsteen, the Seeger tapes that Springsteen did of.
Well, he was another legendary guy I loved as a kid.
Yeah.
And the Weavers are one of my other favorite bands.
Gotcha.
But in fact, I'm going to show you. I grew up on folk music after I saw the Kingston Trio.
Yeah.
Here, I'm going to embarrass you guys. I have a tattoo
Okay.
that I wanted to do, but I had to wait till my Jewish mother died because if she would have seen the tattoo on me, I think she would have dropped dead then. And I waited till she died. And my boy, who's tattooed everywhere, took me to his tattoo artist to do this because I always wanted to do this as a tattoo. Here it is. Guys,
All right.
I'm sorry. It's not in any private place. Don't panic. Wait, I got to get this off here. No, God.
This is a first for the Bear Roars.
Is it really? Wait, I got to get this off. Time out.
They're good. We got plenty of time.
Oh, we do. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I always wanted to do this. And again, I had to wait till my wonderful Jewish mother died because if she would have seen the tattoo on Chucky's face, I've always been known as Chucky since I was born.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Chucky. All right.
Nobody's ever called me. My real name is Charles, and I don't think 10 people have ever called me Charles in my whole life. Anyway, here's a tattoo that I did after my mom died, not that 10 years ago, maybe. And I always wanted to do this tattoo. You ready, gang? Are we ready?
Okay. Well, banjo.
Born to folk.
All right. You getting that good?
Did you get that, Aaron?
All right.
Okay. Yeah.
Born to folk.
Yeah, and I grew up on folk music, loving folk music. I actually, after I saw the Kingston Trio, I bought a tenor Martin guitar, 4-string, because that's what Nick Reynolds of the Kingston Trio played, and started playing it. I still have that.
Oh, wow.
In those days, it was like nothing. Today, it's an old tenor guitar. That's a 4-string guitar, which you can, if you know anything about tuning, it could be tuned to a guitar or to a 4-string banjo. And that's what I grew up playing. I wasn't that good, so I decided if I wanted to be in the music business, it wouldn't be in front of the stage; it would be behind.
Yeah, the producer. What about Joni Mitchell? Did you have a chance to spend time with her?
I've done some dates, but I really don't know her that well.
Yeah. The
big fan, obviously.
Yeah, the special that she did at what was the recent music show? I think it was it the Music Hall of Fame where she came out and
what a
sung
great
there.
artist.
I mean,
what a great songwriter.
Yeah, it was incredible. But that was a really interesting intertwining story
Of Joni?
Yeah, with Bob Dylan. Yeah, that was
Right.
crazy. Yeah, very neat. And then the other person that appeared a couple times in the Dylan movie was Johnny Cash.
You know, it's really interesting. I've done Johnny Cash dates. I managed the Dirt Band for 35 years and helped put together the Will the Circle Be Unbroken Volume 2, which I actually got a Grammy for as executive producer.
Oh, congratulations.
And the Dirt Band won 4 Grammys that year. That was Circle 2. And Johnny Cash played on that. And he was big. If you met him, he was bigger than life. Even if you don't know who he was. He would walk in a room. And if I had a minor, not even criticism about that great movie, was the Johnny Cash figure did not have that. I promoted Johnny through the years, not a lot. And I wouldn't say we were great friends at all, but he was bigger than life when he walked in a room. That was the only thing I thought was just a little slightly disappointing, the character who played him.
I don't know, because every time he was in that Bob Dylan movie, he'd be in there for short clips, but when he was in there, the energy level would jump. He came across as younger than the Johnny Cash I think of.
Right.
But he definitely conveyed to me, this guy's a bigger than life character. I mean,
really?
in the movie
You thought that character?
The way he was portrayed.
I worked with him.
Yeah.
He walked in, even if you didn't know who he was.
Yeah. But that's the sense I got.
Really?
In the movie.
See, I was just
a young version of him, but that when he showed up, that wasn't like anyone else there.
Yeah, but I did
Cash.
not see it. That maybe because I knew him well enough and worked with him through the years once in a while, that he was so bigger than life.
Yeah.
And I was slightly disappointed on the character who played him.
Yeah.
Other than that, I thought it was a great movie.
Yeah.
And what's his name who did Bob was amazing.
Yeah. It was crazy. We'll get some awards.
I'll tell you my favorite Bob Dylan story. I was doing Bob Dylan years ago at the Denver Coliseum. He actually wanted to do a tour of old beat up buildings.
Okay.
So I did him at the Coliseum.
That was the old beat up building back then?
Oh, God, yes. It's been an old bit for years.
Yeah.
And, Dylan is not the kind of guy, Bob is not the kind of guy that comes out and chit-chats with you. That's not him.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget, after the show, I was sitting around with Scott from KBCO and a few people, and Dylan walked out and started talking to us for like 20 minutes. And first of all, that's not
what he does.
Hardly ever does. And it was so great because we really talked about a bunch of things. Even though I promoted his manager of years, Jeff Kramer, I'm best friends with, I've done tons of Dylan dates, but never got to really know him. And God bless him, he can do whatever he wants. And I'm the biggest Dylan fan, but he's just not social.
You know what I rediscovered, or maybe even just discovered for the first time, is maybe a better way to characterize it, just a couple of years ago, was the Traveling Wilburys. I mean, to really appreciate kind of who they were.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like that is about as all-star of a group as you can conceive of. And they only had, maybe a couple years to work together?
Yeah.
But what a
was it
lineup.
2 albums? Yeah.
And what beautiful music they did together.
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah.
Well, Dylan, I mean, to me, he's the greatest poet, writer that ever lived.
Yeah.
And I'm the biggest fan.
Well, he had at least one other great poet writer in the Traveling Wilburys right next to him, Roy Orbison, right?
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah, so you had those two, the guy from Electric Light Wave, one of the Beatles, and who's the fifth guy I'm forgetting? I should know that. The fifth guy, was it not Jackson Brown?
No.
But anyways, I mean, five kind of, front acts all collaborating together, taking turns on who's going to lead a song, who's going to chime in, who wrote the song. Yeah. I mean, what a magical period.
Dylan is still touring.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah. Someone should do something on Traveling Wilburys, because even though it was a short, I mean, that's like.
Oh, that was legendary.
Yeah.
Legendary.
Crazy grouping of people together.
Oh, I know.
So let's go back to Boulder in its heyday as kind of.
You're talking the 70s?
When it was up in the mountains. Well, what was that studio?
I came out to Boulder in 65 to go to graduate school. I was 20 years old. And then I started, I decided I didn't want to get a doctorate. And I wanted to do something with people and music. And I was friendly with a guy named Herbie Kavar, who owned the Sink on the Hill. Yeah. Big hangout, 3-2 beer in those days. And we became friendly because I used to have a beer with him after I left New Orleans.
Did you manage the Sink at some point?
I'll get to that point. Yeah, absolutely. So I dropped out and I wanted to do something with people and music, and I was friendly with Herbie. I used to have a beer with him after I left New Orleans Library studying. He owned the Sink. And one day I was telling him I dropped out of graduate school, and I said I wanted to do something with people, and he said, "Why don't you manage the Sink?" I said, "Well, I've never managed a bar." He said, "No, you're really smart, and people love you here at the Sink," which it continues to be a legendary place. And I took up on that and started managing the Sink. And that was I get my years wrong, by the way. I don't want to remember. Let's see, probably 67, 68. Mm-hmm. And started putting bands in the back room and in the upstairs. There was a little club upstairs. It was a pool place, but I changed it and did some local bands. And I did, one of the second show ever of a band called Flash Cadillac and the Continental Kids, who had in fact, I just went to their farewell show, and they had a long career. They were a regular on the Happy Days TV show. They were in the movie American Graffiti. They were like an oldies act, and I booked them in the back room. They were just getting started for all the beer they could drink, and they've had in fact, I went to their retirement final show a couple of months ago in Colorado Springs. And I booked a young guitar player that moved to Boulder named Tommy Bolin, who, of course, became rather famous and died way too young. But Boulder became such a hip town. A guy named Jim Guercio moved there and opened up Caribou Ranch. I
want to get him on this podcast at some point.
He's a great friend.
Yeah.
To this day.
Oh, he would be great if he could get him on this.
Oh, I bet you. Well, I have his numbers if you want. I mean,
that'd be great.
And he opened up Caribou Ranch Studios, which became sort of the Abbey Roads of the United States. And a lot of artists had moved there in the 70s. Dan Fogelberg moved there. Joe Walsh, who was in the moved to Boulder and started Barnstorm. Stephen Stills moved there and started Manassas. It was such a wonderful music scene. And
bring Caribou Ranch to life for us. Tell us.
Jim Guercio was first in a band and a producer, and moved to Caribou outside Boulder and built Caribou Ranch Studios, which became a legendary place. Everybody recorded it. In fact, Elton John recorded there and had an album called Caribou. Everybody recorded at Caribou Ranch. And I used to hang out there a lot. I would show some of the artists that were playing for me at Tulagis that were thinking about recording at the ranch. I'd bring them up there, and Jimmy was great about that. So many great artists recorded there. It was an outrageous studio. And what was great about Caribou Ranch Studios was it was this big plot of land outside Boulder, and there was a gate around the whole thing. So bands and there was a big place for the bands to sleep and live, and there was a little dining area. So bands, when they recorded at Caribou, they could use it 24 hours a day, and nobody would bother them. It was a great studio, and as I said, some great albums were done there. And Jim Guercio built it. Was originally in a band, and I'll think of the name in a minute. And then a producer, and built a studio. It burnt down, I think, in '86. And Jimmy still lives in Boulder, by the way.
But yeah, no, it'd be great to have him on here. Any specific stories from Caribou Ranch that you experienced that?
Well, those are my bad days, so I don't remember that many of the stories.
What were your bad days marked by?
I did a lot of drugs
rock and roll lifestyle.
Yeah. And, in those days, 70s and 80s, the music business, everybody got high on something. I got sober, by the way, in 1988. I haven't done any drugs or alcohol since.
Congratulations.
I had to do that. The Buckinghams. That's the group, the Buckinghams. That was his band.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was their hit? Kind of a Drag, I think. What was their hit? These things pop in my brain. I don't know how. I'm right. Funny, I can forget people who work with me for 15 years, their name, but I could tell you Jimmy's first band, the Buckinghams, in the 70s. It's weird. My shrink once told me when I was saying, I remember stuff from how many tickets J.J. Cale did in 1978, but I can't remember somebody who worked in my AEG office or CSU, their names. And my shrink once told me, it made so much sense. She said, when you get older, like me, long-term memory stays better than short-term memory.
Yeah.
Which really rang a bell, at least for me and half my friends.
Yeah, for me, I just can't remember names off the top of my head. That's my hardest thing. But I don't know if it's gotten worse as I've gotten older, because it's always been pretty bad. So when it burned down, was it at the height of it, or was it already fading away?
No, it was never fading away. It just burnt down, and Jimmy never rebuilt the studio. He lived up there for years. Now he lives in Boulder.
Yep.
But studios... the studio business is a dying business. Mm-hmm. Once things like ADAT machines and stuff like that happen, bands make their records in their living rooms with high quality, and studio business is sort of, a lot of it has died out.
So we don't know this while we're talking here, but might know it by the time this is dropped. The Sundance Film Festival is rethinking where it's at.
I know
Boulder's
about that,
Boulder's one of the finalists, which would be incredible.
Yeah.
If there was a path to do this, and I personally would financially support it, it'd be great to have like a music event here, like a music long weekend that uses the various venues that we have in and around Boulder. So not
in Denver.
Yeah. Not one that is at some kind of campground where it's kind of just a weekend or night, but one that is spread across the town, kind of like how Sundance would be.
Colorado has had great halls. I mean, when my old company, I built the Fillmore. I was running Chuck Morris, Bill Graham Presents as partners with BGP. And they, of course, Bill Graham opened the Fillmore East and Fillmore West. And when I made Bill had died, but when I made the deal, I said, we ought to think about building a Fillmore in Denver. Yeah. And I had this idea of the old beat up Mammoth Gardens would make a great Fillmore. And we built it.
And you worked with Phil Anschutz on that, is that right?
No, that was later on with AEG.
Later on. Okay.
That was later part of my career.
So tell us more about when you built that out.
Well, because they had the brand name, the most important club in America. I said, I remember I flew out to Bill Graham Presents San Francisco and Greg Perloff, and I said, there's an old beat up building I think would make a great Fillmore. I'll never say Greg, who I'm still great friends with. He runs a company now called Another Planet in San Francisco. But I'll never forget. He said, well, Bill, who had died previous to that, he said, Bill wouldn't want to have like a bunch of Fillmores. We already have had 2. Of course, Fillmore East closed years before that. But he came out, him and his partner, Sherry Wasserman, came out, and I showed them Mammoth Gardens, and they looked at it and said, Bill would think this could be a Fillmore. So we bought the old beat up Mammoth Gardens.
Tell me where Mammoth Gardens is.
It's on Colfax. It's still the Fillmore.
Okay, yeah. So Colfax and
Ogden Theater, which we run, is down the street. Yeah.
Yep. Gotcha.
But that's when we built the Fillmore in Denver.
And how long were you associated with the Fillmore?
Well, sort of complicated. I was Barry Fay's #1 guy, who was the main promoter in the 70s and 80s. And his company was Fayline, and I was the #1 senior vice president and major buyer and blah, blah, blah. And did that. And then I think I remember my life here. So I was running BGP Chuck. It was called BGP Chuck Morris. And BGP Chuck, a guy named Bob Silliman was buying up all these promoter companies, and he bought the Bill Graham company and became SFX, and he bought my part of the Bill Graham company, so I became SFX in the Rocky Mountains. SFX sold it to Clear Channel, which I continued to run, and then Clear Channel spun it off to Live Nation, which I continued to run. And then my old friend Phil Anschutz called me. AEG was exploding. Anschutz Entertainment was exploding around the world. And I was friendly with Phil Anschutz, long story short. Phil was a big fan of my band, the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, who I managed for years. They were the second national band that played for me. I became best friends with them. And Phil loved it. Doesn't go to a lot of shows, but loved the Dirt Band and went to a bunch of shows. And I got friendly with Phil. And one day in April of '88, I believe, now this is before AEG was even open yet, Anschutz Entertainment, he called me one day and said, why don't you come by the office? So we became really good friends. Me and Phil, who I still to this day adore, love the guy. And he said, Phil was born in Russell, Kansas, spent the rest of part of his life in Russell and then Denver. He was a big art collector. And when he started making money, big money, he built a thing called the Anschutz Western Art Collection, which is the biggest in the world, priceless. And sometimes he tours it around the world to promote the West and his collection. It's nonprofit. He didn't make money on it. He just loves to promote the West because of his background has been in the West. And one day he called me and said, the Anschutz collection is opening up at the Trechia Museum in Moscow for a 6-month run. And I'd like to bring, I've never done this before, but I want to bring my favorite country band, my dirt band, to open up the exhibit in Moscow at the Trechia Museum. And so he flew me and the band. And by the way, he said, I'm doing a lot of other business in Moscow because he made his first $1 billion in oil business. And his dad. And,
well, just a side note on Phil. So I told you, we don't, you know very little about me, but I told you we're going to talk about your book in a little bit, but I'm at the final stages of a book that's going to be released next week.
Oh, that's great.
And guess who's part of that story? Is Phil Anschutz, because the book is about the creation of all the it's called Bandwidth, the creation of all the fiber networks, and his story.
Quest.
Full Soil,
all about
Speech Telecom Quest. We were his rivals. Our paths crossed a lot.
Wow, interesting.
But what Phil did really, I wouldn't be here in Colorado if it wasn't for Phil, because we wouldn't have located our company Level 3 here if it wasn't for SP Telecom and Quest.
One of my favorite people in the world.
For the first time, Dan Caruso pulls back the curtain in his book Bandwidth, a memoir that celebrates the pioneers who invented the internet's early backbones, the renegades who lit the fiber revolution, the antics that caused the biggest market crash of all time, and the new wave of entrepreneurs who led the industry back from its ashes. Though it seemed to happen in the blink of an eye, the Bandwidth adventure was a multi-decade roller coaster ride involving larger-than-life successes and devastating failures. The unbridled ambition of newly minted billionaires and high-profile tycoons created extraordinary value, unprecedented value destruction, and endless opportunities for a brave few. This reflects tech's past, present, and future, and is a story you won't soon forget. It will help you prosper during today's AI tech bubble. The book is available at dan-caruso.com/bandwidthbook and released in early 2025.
Anyway, so he flew me in the dirt band into Moscow, and he said, I'm going to be there for 9 other nights doing oil business, doing a lot of other business. So I'll pay every expense, give the band their fee, and they can do this private show when the Anschutz collection was opening in Moscow. And at the Trechia Museum, I took my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife and mother of 3 of my kids. And so I'll never forget. So I called, Phil said, the guys do it. I'll put up everybody for like 9 nights that I'm in Moscow, and the other 8 nights, I'll take everybody out for dinner. And I'll never forget, I called back Phil and I said, I talked to the band and they're thrilled, but we'd love to play a couple of other shows in Moscow while you were there, because the show at the Trechia Museum for the Anschutz collection was mostly art people and Soviet Union officials right before the Soviet Union fell, and press. I said, we'd love to play a couple of free shows, maybe at a few other places. And if I thought Phil up to that day was like a king, he calls me back in 3 days and says, okay, the first night you're going to open up the Anschutz collection on this private show. The second night I arranged a private concert at this beautiful opera house in downtown Moscow. And I'm inviting Soviet Union officials, their families, the U.S. Embassy and their families, and we give 3,000 tickets to Russian students. And the third night I arranged, and if I ever thought up till that day that Phil was like a king, he said, I'll never forget what he told me. He said, Chuck, I said yes, and I'm not sure if you and the band would want to do it, but I do a lot of business in the Soviet Union, and I found that if you tell people, I got to go back to the band to see if they'll do it, it'll go away. So I said yes. I hope you're not mad at me. Phil talked to me like this. He said, Phil, we'll do whatever you want. This is going to be so much fun. And the band's all excited. He said, okay, we're going to do a free concert in Gorky Park.
Oh, wow.
And there were like 15,000 people there.
Wow.
And that's when I became best friends with the whole Anschutz family. It was a long time ago, 1980. AEG wasn't even open yet.
So I listened to someone put me onto a podcast about what was the song in that era?
In the 70s?
Yeah, well, actually be 80s. Your German band, Gorky Park, was featured in it, and there were all these kind of stories later on about this was a CIA operation getting the band to publish a song that became a global hit
and
helped take down.
Was it a German band?
Winds of.
I bet was it a German band?
Yeah.
I bet it was Kraftwerk.
No, look up Winds of. You'll recognize the song. You probably know the story. Winds of Fire. It's on Winds of something. Winds of Change. It might be that.
Now this is a
1980s song by the Scorpions. So
great band.
If one of you guys could pull up the music of it, so you'll recognize it. I don't know if you remember the song. It's global
Scorpions
classic.
hit?
Yeah, Scorpions.
Yeah, probably once I heard it.
So what was said is that, and they referenced Gorky Park in the song, but it was.
For those who don't know, Gorky Park is like the Central Park of Moscow.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah, see if you can play it to the microphone.
Now, this is
Scorpions.
Scorpions. Oh, great band. It's still around.
Yeah, so this song was supposedly, according to folklore, secretly funded or influenced to be produced the way it was produced by the CIA in a covert operation that they say helped bring down the Soviet Union. So go to Gorky Park for Winds of Change. Yeah, it probably brings back.
My 9 nights with Phil and his family and my dirt band in Moscow in '88 was like, it was mind-blowing for me because all my grandparents were Russian immigrants, came over when they were killing Jews in Russia. And so all my grandparents were, I'm a Russian Jew.
Yep. Yeah, the When did the Soviet Union fall? I mean, that would have been right about that time.
90.
That's nice. So
Yeah, it was
maybe
right
you
before
guys are
it
one that
fell.
brought it down.
I don't think so.
Yeah. I in this podcast series I listened to, I think they might have mentioned in that the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band
Playing
out there.
I was there.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll have to
At Gorky Park.
At Gorky Park, yeah. But wow. So what was your overall impressions of the Soviet Union when you were
Then
there?
in '88.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I loved it because I'm the grandkids of Russian Jews. That's been my heritage.
Yep.
I loved going there and seeing the people were amazing. It was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. It fell, I think, 2 years later.
Yeah.
Amazing people, and being a grandson of 4 Russian immigrants that came here. Some of them illegally.
Yeah. What about? Do you remember anything about the meals you ate while you were there?
Yeah, Russian food is not the greatest. I never liked Russian food, although it was really interesting. Well, I still remember. What blew my mind is even like lunches at the hotel, they have caviar.
Yeah.
Which is like us putting out tuna fish. Caviar was everywhere. It's their, staple of the history of Russia. And it was amazing. Even inexpensive restaurants had caviar out there.
And the stories of how much vodka is drank per person is off the charts.
They love to drink.
Yeah, they love the vodka.
Yeah, that was one of my biggest, going to the Soviet Union with the Anschutz family and my dirt band was still this day one of my I still look up to one of the great things I did and lived through.
Yeah.
I love it. My grandparents all came over here, mostly illegal. From some Russia when they were killing Jews, and so I'm the grandsons of 4 Russian immigrants.
Yeah, we have multiple people right around here who were born in Moscow or born in Ukraine, and
right.
There's a couple of close friends of ours, and they tell the stories of how it was when they're growing up, and they still have family there, and it's just very interesting.
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely interesting. I mean, when I went there, if anybody knows, the Anschutz was like Libby Anschutz was like, let me think. Christian Anschutz's son was like 12. Libby was 15, and Sarah Anschutz was 17.
Yep.
Now they're, a lot of years later. So I really became best friends then with the whole Anschutz family. And when he started AEG, he gave me a call. I was running Chuck Marshall Graham, which became Live Nation, and he called and came over there, and he said, we already have offices in London. AEG owns the O2 in London, the O2 in Berlin. We have tours. Right now, we're in the middle of 2 little tours. One of them is the Rolling Stones around the world, and the other is Elton John's farewell tour. And asked me to open up the AEG regional office in Denver, which I opened 19 years ago or whatever.
And what was the AEG regional office? What was the scope of what you guys were
From
doing?
here to Seattle to the Northwest.
Yep.
When I open it now, AEG, just in Denver alone, either owns or operates the Ogden, the Bluebird, the Gothic. We built a Mission Ballroom. We do 160 shows at Red Rocks. We took over Fiddler's Green. Last year, I think AEG did 1,300 shows just in Colorado.
Yep. For the commercial for the Crucial Ventures team, when we talk about like what do we want to be when we grow up, this is the kind of stuff that Phil took his early success in railroads and in oil.
Yeah, oil first
and
and
then in
then
telecom.
railroads.
But he did all this other stuff with that is the legacy of.
Oh, yeah. He is, one of the most, maybe the most brilliant person I became best friends with. What he's done.
Yep.
And when he buys things, it's usually for 4 other reasons. He started buying phone companies and then formed Quest. When it went public, sold it. But he, and one of the reasons it was successful because he owned 4 railroad companies, the biggest in the West, and he used those for communication lines.
Yes.
He's buying stuff for 9 reasons, which I can never figure out.
Yep. And he's had to overcome his own set of adversity too to get there. He had some near death,
he and his dad,
business experiences.
Drilled oil and almost went bankrupt, and then hit a big one, sold it to Exxon and parlayed that into God knows how many companies he owns now.
Yep.
And one of the most philanthropic people in the world, the Anschutz Hospital, he built and still donates a ton every year to start new departments.
Yep.
He is unbelievably philanthropic. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of Phil.
Yes, as you should be. Okay, so let's go forward with you. So tell us what happened next in your journey.
Say it again.
What happened next in your journey? So
what are we up
it's
to?
the late
When I started
it's the late
AEG,
80s.
And ran AEG, but I always wanted to start a music business program at a major university in Colorado as a second career. I have through the years, while I was second in command at Phaline or running Clear Live Nation, I spoke at a lot of colleges and loved doing that.
Actually, you know what? We're gonna come back to that in a little bit. But before we get out of where we were before, I want you to share with us some just crazy ass stories of what it was like to be in the music business. Really, in some ways, in the heyday of the music business, the 70s, you came out of the 60s, then 70s was a whole different thing. And as you went to the 80s, give us what life was like when you were smack in the middle of the music business, touring, having events, doing the drugs, like all the craziness.
This is before HR. And there were sort of no rules. It was, and before computers, Faye and I used to make offers on like towels or on toilet paper to send to a band. There was no computers. It was the wild, wild west, the early days of the music. Well, I consider the early days of the music business. And it's really interesting. Some people say, well, didn't you hate the music business when it changed and you had HR rules and you had, a lot more accountants and lawyers? No, I think in a lot of ways, the music business is better these days. It was great. I loved it. Don't get me wrong, but I think, I tell people, the music business has really cleaned itself up. In the old days, everybody was doing drugs and partying. Presidents of every label. God knows the parties I can tell you about.
Well,
and
please do.
Agents and managers, not rather not. But, but these days, there are a lot more lawyers and accountants.
I don't want to know about these days. I want to know about those days.
Well, it was the wild, wild west. Honestly, and by the way, my children know all of my past. In fact, I'm writing an autobiography right now that'll spell out all my wild, crazy days.
And I want to come back to the autobiography in a little bit too.
Sure. But, when I was the number one guy at Phaline, it was so crazy. When we would buy time from radio stations, the radio guys that sold us would come into our office and I wouldn't buy time till they got me high. And that's the way it was. I always kid around. The music business has cleaned itself up. I know other businesses that have a lot more drug addiction than the music business. It became so big that, and billionaires like Phil moved into it, and publicly traded companies, they had to be more together.
Yeah.
Or you would be either dead or out of the business, like some of my friends.
Yeah, no,
I was willing to change with the times.
Yep.
And I got sober, and I learned, I'd have to be a lot more straight if I wanted to continue being in our business.
Yeah, no, it's some similarities. When I think back, because I had to reflect a lot on kind of my journey as I was putting together the book of Bandwidth, and man, when it was the 80s, and early 90s, it was a different world. Everything was just, it was just kind of, I'll use the same word, Wild West. You just did what you did, and there wasn't, we were, wild entrepreneurs in those days doing stuff that you weren't supposed to do, spending money that you didn't really know where it came from, and building networks and traveling. And, every night you went out to dinner and drank, and
I was right there.
Stuff that happened then would not fly well in today's world. We weren't like the music business or the movie business. It wasn't, that kind of crazy stuff going on, at least not in the circles I was with. But but still the things you did do, you'd get fired over.
In those days, I would sometimes get women of the night, pay them and be around for a manager that liked that. And I would have them at the shows. And that was part of our business.
Yeah. Yeah. No, have some companions.
Yeah. And it was no big deal.
Yeah.
But,
just a little
and
different.
I always say, when people say, aren't you unhappy these days the way it's changed? No, I'm so much happier because, they used to pay bands directly. Now they have a tour accountant and lawyers, and it's a better business. Mm-hmm. And I was able to live through it and change with the times.
Great.
And learned how to change with the times. And people that didn't are either dead from ODing or out of the business.
Yep. And any other kind of people that you met in that era, the Colton, the 80s and 90s in the business that are worth highlighting now? Kind of either played a meaningful role in your...
The band that I got friendly with at the very beginning was a little band called U2. You might have heard about that.
Oh, yes.
And I booked them years ago at the Rainbow Music Hall. It was a club that I owned, that Faye owned, and I owned part of, and I was his main buyer. And we booked this little band from Dublin, and they played Rainbow, which was 1,200 seats.
And where's Rainbow at?
It was on Evans and Monaco. Yeah. And I remember it was a $2 concert. It was their first tour in America. And I'm really proud of this. I was blown away by that band. And it was sold out, but it was $2 concert. And the next day they were off. And I said, I want to show you Red Rocks Amphitheater. In fact, this is when the 50 greatest moments in rock and roll and Rolling Stone, they mentioned that I took them to Red Rocks. But anyway, so I said, you got to see this place that we promote called Red Rocks. I'll never forget, I took the whole band in the back of my Jeep with an open top up to Red Rocks to show them, and they were blown away. Of course, they became, to this day, one of the biggest acts in the world. And I'll never forget when I took them up there, and they were blown away by it. And I said, someday you guys are going to play in this place. And they said, we're not going to get that big. And of course they did. And they're famous under the Blood Red Sky, of course, made them even bigger. And a great bunch of guys, the nicest guys. And in fact, I'll tell you another U2 story. And like the following summer, I got friendly with them when they played for me at the Rainbow. They still weren't that big yet. And I was in London on vacation. And I called their manager, who managed them for years, a guy named Paul McGuinness. And I said, I'm in London. I'd like to come to Dublin and take you and the guys out for dinner, because I got friendly with them and I really liked them. And he said, really? I said, yeah. So I got to Dublin, and I'll never forget this as long as I live. And he said, David Evans, The Edge, wants to pick you up. And he just got his first car at the hotel, and I'd meet the rest of the band and Paul, their manager. And I'll never forget. And they gave me David's number to tell him when I was ready. And I called him, and his mother answered. He was still living at home, and he said, in a big Irish drawl, David, there's an American on the phone. I'll never forget that. And Dave said, I can't believe he came all the way to Dublin to take us to dinner. And I just got my first car, and I'm going to pick you up. And it was a beat-up old car. And I took the whole band out for a dinner in Dublin. They weren't that big yet. And I'll never forget, when they were playing, I don't know, 8 years ago, I wasn't even promoting them anymore. At least they had a tour, some other company was. And Paul McGuinness said, I'm going to come in a day early. Well, let's have dinner. And after the show, which was great, they said, listen, we're going to go to the airport to our planes. And why don't you come in the limos to the airport? And because they were playing Salt Lake the next night. And I'll never forget that. And to this day, I remember seeing David years later. He said, I still remember that time, Chuck, when you took us out to dinner in Dublin. And yeah,
I have a little Edge story myself, not nearly as interesting as yours, but there's this organization called Endeavor Global that's all about promoting entrepreneurship across the world, and they're operating in over 40 countries.
Wow.
The co-founder and CEO of Endeavor Global was on my board at Zayo. So when I sold Zayo, I said I would start Endeavor Colorado. Well, the same year, I think even the same month that I sponsored and launched Endeavor Colorado, The Edge launched and sponsored Endeavor Ireland. So, and he's still the chair of that board. And I'm still the chair of Endeavor Colorado. So I haven't met him in person, but I've been, well, that's not true. We were actually at an event together and just, said some pleasantries, but Zoom calls with him.
I'll tell you, those are one of those bands that have become one of the biggest acts in the world, and they're still the same kind of guys if you meet them.
Yeah, for him to allocate his time, brand to support entrepreneurship in Ireland is a big deal, because he can, the whole idea of the organization is find those kick-ass entrepreneurs who are doing really interesting things and help them really scale their companies on a global basis. And, he's choosing to do that, which is, really positive.
I'll tell you, I was really flattered. Rolling Stone 4 or 5 years ago had the greatest moments in rock and roll history, the 50 greatest moments. And one of them was U2 at Red Rocks under the blood red sky. And in the story, I was so flattered. Bono said, our first promoter, Chuck Morris, took us up to Red Rocks and we never thought we'd get this big. And he mentioned it at me, which I was flattered to mention us.
Great. Any other groups that, jump out at you from those eras?
From the 70s and 80s?
Yeah.
Well, too many to count.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, when I opened my first club, Tulagi's, and I booked a band called the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, and they were already getting pretty big, and I later went and managed them for 25 years.
Wow.
Became my best friends. I retired from management, but I'll never forget, they pulled up to Tulagi's in their band bus, and they got out, and one of the guys, Jeff or John McEwen or somebody, said, we have our manager, Bill McEwen, John's brother, has this funny young comic who's opening up the shows. Just give him $100. And I said, great, I don't care. And it was a young guy named Steve Martin. And he came out, and I didn't know. No one knew who he was. And I watched that show and destroyed the place.
Let's Get Small.
And he had the balloons and the arrow through his head.
One of my favorite albums this day.
Killed me. And I did a lot of Steve Martin dates. I did the famous show at Red Rocks, which became a live record. And he became, in fact, one of the reasons I started managing the band was Bill McEwen and John McEwen called me in like 82. And I became great friends with the band and with Bill and John, the whole band. And they said, why don't you come up to Aspen? At that point, the whole band was living in Aspen, and Bill McEwen, their manager, John's brother, was managing them. And I said, sure. And I came up, and I'll never forget, I met with Bill McEwen and John McEwen from the band, and they said, Bill said, I'm getting so busy, I'm getting ready to produce this movie called The Jerk. And I'm too busy with Steve Martin. And why don't you take over the Dirt Band and manage them? This was 82. I actually tried to convince Bill. I said, I don't manage anybody. And it's like, I'm a promoter and a club owner. I'll never forget, Bill McEwen had to convince me to take over the Dirt Band. I'll never forget, Bill said to me, he said, Chuck, first of all, that their music as well as anybody in the world, you love what they're about. You may be a history of promoting and club owning, but it's the other side of the coin. You're going to make a great manager. And I started managing them, was responsible for a big comeback in the country world, and actually won a Grammy. They won 4 Grammys for The Circle Being Broken Volume 2 a little bit later. And, one of the great relationships in my entire career.
I might actually have the Steve Martin album you're describing.
Oh, at Aspen.
Up there, up top
at Red
there.
Rocks.
Yeah. I don't know if it's the Red Rocks, but it's was it titled, the one with the balloon, was it titled Wild and Crazy Guy?
It was Live from Red Rocks.
Was that the album? Red Rocks? I might have it. I might have grabbed it out of my parents' basement 6 months ago.
Funny guy. I saw it at the very beginning when I gave him $100 to open with the Dirt Band on the bus.
If I didn't listen to that album, 30 times, I'd be surprised.
I'll never forget.
I just keep listening to those routines over and over again.
He was brilliant. He's had such a great career as so many movies now. He's a big star. But I'll never forget the first time when he finally sold out Red Rocks. And he walked on stage. I was promoting the date. And I'll never forget, it was the most beautiful night at Red Rocks you could ever imagine. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. There were 9,000 people with balloons and noses and screaming for him. And he walks on stage. There's a monster screaming, for Steve. I'll never forget this as long as it was so brilliant and so funny. So he walks on stage, and I'm standing on the side because I was promoting the show. And Steve looks around to this crazy 9,000 people. And I don't know if he planned it because he was so brilliant or he ad-libbed it, but I'll never forget. He walks out there and looks at this audience and says, "My manager put me in this dump. Could you please excuse me for a minute?" And walked off stage for about 8 minutes pretending he was calling his manager to complain about Red Rocks. I couldn't believe it. It was so brilliant and so funny. I'll never forget that as long as I live.
Great. All right, before we go on, how about one more kind of person you came across and touched paths with that really jumps out in your memories? Anyone else we could pull out of you?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's so many. I don't want to sound snobby here. I did a lot of Elton John dates going way, way back. And
you look a little like Elton John.
Well, let me tell you, I'm well known for my glasses. In fact, I'm trying to find a 12-step program for glasses. I have about 80 pair. They're all prescription. Of course, Elton was famous, and I was doing Elton John, and he was eating, and I sat next to him, and we started talking about eyeglass collection. Now, the only difference between Elton and me is I have glasses that, is expensive, maybe $300 to $500. Elton has glasses that has diamonds around it. They're more like $5,000, but we talk about loving glasses. I got rid of most of my abuses except buying glasses. As I said, I'm trying to find a program, 12-step program for glass addiction, but I don't think there is any. And we chatted. I'll never forget backstage. It was at the Pepsi Center, talking about eyeglasses.
And I have to ask this name only because he, as a musician, he's probably impacted my life more than any other musician, which is Bruce Springsteen. Ever cross paths with Bruce?
Yes. I'll tell you a very funny story. Faye and Bruce had exploded, and we wanted him to play Red Rocks. Hadn't played Denver before. But at that point, he was only playing indoors and didn't want to play an outdoor place. He was playing smaller rooms. I'll never forget. I had to get pictures of Red Rocks and all sorts of stuff and send it to his manager, who was still managing him. And we convinced him to play Red Rocks. And that was one of the greatest days when he first played at Red Rocks Amphitheater.
Gosh, I wish I could have seen him there.
Oh, God. Yeah, I've been lucky to have promoted bands. Of course, some of them have been around, some of them are no longer with us.
Yeah, probably a lot.
But, I'll tell you, speaking of early bands, one of the things I'm most, I'm most proud of, when I started managing the Dirt Band and a guy named Leo Kotke, who became one of my best friends, managed him for years, I decided in the middle 80s I was going to put a band together, a country band with a girl singer. Because at that point, there wasn't any bands in country music that had a lead girl singer. Now there's a ton of them. So I started auditioning people in Denver and put together a band that became Highway 101, that became Country Group of the Year. And I literally auditioned people. One of the main guys who actually helped me put it together was a drummer named Cactus Mosier. And Cactus was in a bunch of bands in Denver, and he was the best drummer that ever come out of Denver. And I'll never forget, he had moved to L.A., great drummer. And I called him and I said, Cactus, I want to fly you in. We're putting together this band with a girl singer. I found a young girl singer named Paulette Carlson. Actually, my lawyer at the time played me her tapes. And I was blown away. And we auditioned people and we put the band together. In fact, we signed with Warner Brothers Nashville as the no-name band because we didn't even have a name. And when of course, once the record was done and getting ready to come out. We had a name. And I'll never forget that we had a band meeting. We were finishing the album. We had to come up with a name. Now, I've known Cactus Mosher, who grew up in Denver, was in a bunch of bands. And since he was 16, great drummer. And I'll never forget, we had a band meeting. I said, well, we got to come up with a band name, guys. And they had just finishing the album, the first Highway 101 record. They would still call it the No Name. They hadn't played any dates. And I'll never forget, America had a big hit called Ventura Highway. I said, let's call it Ventura Highway. Great name. And Cactus said, well, Ventura Highway, because he had been living in LA for a while, is actually Highway 101. And we all yelled, that's a great idea for the name of the band. And I signed that band to Warner's Nashville as the No Name Band. And then it became Highway 101. And we had a whole bunch of hits, became Country Group of the Year. So proud about helping put that together.
And who was the lead singer, you said?
Paulette Carlson was the name.
Okay.
And Cactus was the drummer, and he found a couple of other players, Jack Daniels and Curtis Stone, and right out of the box, it blew up. I was probably more proud of doing that in my whole career than anything else because I had this crazy idea and made it happen.
So in that, time frame, so-called in the 90s,
80s.
In the 80s, what would your friends say about you? Here's what you're all about. Like, how would they describe your personality
in those days?
Yeah.
Without sounding too egomaniacal, I was great at finding young bands that had a magic about them and promoted them. That touched. I was really great. Not finding groups, unnamed groups, either promoted them or managed them. Mostly promoted them that had a magic about them. And I was really good at picking bands. Not anymore. Later in my career, I let other people do that who were much more hip to the younger stuff.
But how would they describe your personality? How would they describe if they're sitting out having a beer with you or getting high with you or traveling with you?
What would they say you were? A crazy, brilliant guy that knew how to pick good music, great music. Predicted who was going to get big.
Yeah, because it's one thing to predict it. It's another thing to get them to want to work with you. How would you get them to want you to be
a band?
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess to convince a band to work with me, I was a real musicologist and really, I was in the music business for the right reasons, not for making a lot of money. I never thought when I dropped out of graduate school and started my first club, Tulagis, I thought that would last 6 months and I'd be back getting my PhD. And that was like 55 years ago. I never thought I'd make a living in this thing. I guess musicians knew I was in it for the right reasons, maybe.
Yep. Good. So now let's jump forward. You started to tell us earlier about you wanting to create a college program around music. So maybe walk us through that a little bit.
Well, I'm the son of a school teacher in Brooklyn. I always respected teachers. And through my career as a promoter, I spoke at a lot of colleges on one-offs, and I loved it. I spoke at a bunch of schools, and I vowed that once I accomplished everything I could in the music industry, my career, and frankly made enough money that I could live on a professor's salary, I wanted to start a music business program at a major university full-time as a second career. And when I thought the time was right, I had offers from different universities. And CSU, I was friendly with a lady named Amy Parsons, who now is the president of CSU. She was the associate chancellor. And I knew her as a young lawyer working for one of my great friends, the late Steve Farber. She was a young lawyer, and I always became friends with her. And when I started looking at different schools, she heard I wanted to open a music business department. And she was the assistant. What was she not? She's president now of the school. She was associate chancellor or something. And she said, can we make a little presentation at CSU? And I came up to CSU, and I was blown away by their attitude, I was blown away by the school, and we opened it. We're going into, I think, our 5th year. we started out with one class with 35 students. This last semester, we had 4 sold-out classes with 375 students, different topics. And it was always my dream to do that. And I guess I did it, and I'm having the time of my life running this music business department at CSU. And I've had a lot of my friends, guest lecture, either live or by teams. Let me tell you, some of the artists that have done my main intro class I've had artists, Lyle Lovett. I've had Ben from Mumford & Sons. I've had Mike Gordon of Fish. I've had Grizz. I've had Millennium. I've had so many artists, and it's been great.
And what would you take them through in your
I would usually how they got in the music business and why, and give the students an idea of some of these big acts. I've had executives guest lecture. Jay Marciano, who's CEO now of AEG Worldwide, actually went to CSU. He was one of my first guests. And we've had Paul Tillett, my friend who owns Coachella. We've had, Dave Matthews, tour accountant. We've had all sorts of executives. Bob Rue, who's the president of Live Nation in America, spoke. Who was great. And I'm very proud that a lot of my friends of a long time have been willing to either do it by teams or live, come up to.
And how much was it about the business of music versus the artists of music?
What do you mean?
When you would have guests?
Well, usually the guests I have at my main class talk about how they got in the music business and how they ended up where they are. Their story. Usually,
but a lot of them were business, as you described it. A lot of them grew up on the business side of music as opposed to the.
Are you talking about executives?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've had artists and we've had executives.
So they'd see both.
Yeah, and it really has been, great for these young students at CSU to hear the stories of some of these executives who became huge. And some of these artists who became huge and how they got it, how they did it, and how they succeeded. Usually when the artist comes in, I'll introduce them. It's our class that has about 110 students. I'll introduce them, talk about their careers, talk about my relationship with them, and then I'd introduce the act, and he either live or by teams. And the students can, if it's by teams, we have big screens in the big classrooms where the students can see them, and they can see the students. I'll introduce them. They'll talk about how they got to where they are, and then we open it up to the students to ask questions. And I'm real proud of that. The guests we've had in our program at CSU, I think it's the best guests of any music business program in the country. When I first started in the music business, there wasn't one university in the country that had music business. Now there's about 25 schools that have it. And I'm real proud that it sort of exploded and done so well at CSU.
And you started that in what time frame?
4 years ago.
So that's all recent too. So
Well, when
I
left running AEG for this part of the country, and I started the program 4 years ago, so I always wanted that as a second career.
And why CSU as opposed to one of the other universities?
I really liked, and it was never about money. I'm at a point in my life where it's not about money. I'm very lucky. I never thought I can make a living, let alone a good living. I just loved that. I met, they had about 12 people there. They had the business school, the chancellor, all sorts of people, and I was blown away by this university. That used to be this little tiny school in a little tiny town. CSU now is almost as big as Boulder. There's 32,000 kids
I didn't know
school
that.
there. It's huge, but still has that local small town feel and small town university. Yeah, and I'm having the time of my life doing this. I bought a place up near school, and I'm up there 4 days a week, and I'm loving it. When I stepped down running AEG for this part of the country, I stayed on as I'm chairman emeritus of AEG, so I still consult for my old company for AEG, and run this program, which I'm having the time of my life.
Yeah, certain students must be standing out to you.
Oh, when I had like Millennium, I had there, and he sold out Mile High Stadium. They were like blown away. He didn't do it live. He did it by teams, but it was it was great.
Wow. So tell us about the Colorado Music Hall of Fame. What's that all about? You are a member of it. So tell us about that.
I always wanted to start a music hall of fame, and I helped create it a bunch of years ago.
Okay, so you helped create the Colorado.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and, we've inducted some great people. I got inducted one year, me and KBCO together, and some great people that were either transplanted to Colorado and spent a big chunk of their career here, or grew up, born and raised here.
Yep. And is it a physical location? Or is
yes. Well, right now they're looking at it's been at the trading post at Red Rocks, and all the inductions and all the stuff we've gotten from every artist that has been inducted. This is a big thing when I got inducted. And I'm real proud of the fact that we built this great Colorado Music Hall of Fame. And it seems to get bigger and bigger. We've had I wish I had the list in front of me who got inducted, but.
One of you guys want to look up the Colorado Hall of Fame and tell some of the inductees?
Yeah, well, remind me about it. I should know it. I've been in every induction.
Would they do inductions once a year?
Yeah. And sometimes we have a concert of the inductees.
Oh, wow.
And celebrate them.
Mm.
Just start from the top. Astronauts, it was great to induct them. They were one of the first big groups that came out of Denver and Boulder and had a long career. We inducted them. Who's some of the others we inducted? Barnstorm is Joe Walsh's band. Joe Walsh grew up in Cleveland, was in the James Gang, and then moved to Boulder and started Barnstorm. And, of course, wrote Rocky Mountain Way, which was their big hit. And I become great friends with Joe forever.
Oh, he must be. What was he like to hang with?
In the old days?
Yeah.
Oh, he was a maniac. He talks about that.
Yeah.
And he's become one of my best friends in the world. I love Joe. I've worked with him since Barnstorm.
Life's been good to me so far.
Boy, that's his life story.
I know. There's autobiography in that song.
When the Eagles was split up for 14 years, and this is public knowledge. I'm not giving any secrets away from Joe. When they decided to get back together, they told him he had to get sober because the other guys in the band, most of them, had gotten sober. And so he got sober in 1994, right before the Eagles reunion tour, and has been sober ever since.
You're kidding?
No. He was a great drunk, just like I was, and we were great. We've been great friends ever since.
Yep.
But when he moved to Boulder and started Barnstorm, we've been best friends ever. I mean, real great friends.
Did he live in Boulder proper?
Yeah.
Where was he in Boulder?
Oh God, I can't remember, but he's had an amazing career.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, the other one we inducted was Dan Fogelberg.
Oh, tell us about Dan Fogelberg.
Nicest, brilliant guy.
Was it CCI? Was he? So
No.
Fogelberg was.
No, he was just Dan Fogelberg. Moved to Boulder and became such a big star, and died way too young from prostate cancer. And when we inducted him, we did a tribute to him. I think it was at Fiddler's Green, with a bunch of bands that loved him. I think I had the Dirt Band on that show. I had, if you want to look that up, a tribute to Dan Fogelberg, and Gene Fogelberg, his wife at the time, came out, and we put that show together with Irving Azoff, who was Dan's best friend and managed most of his career.
Oh, I bet Irving. Actually, we have a place in Cabo, and he has a place there.
And Irving's one of my best friends in the world.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I go back with the Eagles' second show at Tulagis before they made their first album.
Oh,
they were rehearsing to make their first album. Mm-hmm. And Irving, my oldest friends, I love him to death. And I still talk to him 3 times a week. And what a career he's had. And Jeffrey, his son, is doing great. I was there when Jeffrey was in diapers. And now Jeffrey manages a little band called Harry Styles.
Oh,
he's doing real
well.
And but I've been great friends with Irving to this day. Love the guy. Most brilliant, one of the most I always say maybe the two most brilliant people I've ever been best friends with probably are Phil and Irving.
Oh, wow. Well,
So smart.
I'll probably see him there before too long, and I'll
Give him a
mention
big kiss from me.
I'm pretty certain he won't want a kiss from me, but I'll certainly give him regards.
I mean, literally, sometimes people name drop and they barely know. Irving, I've been with him from 72 on.
Yep.
I met him, first time I met him live, I was doing Dan Fogelberg at Ebbets Field, and he flew in. It was the first time I met him in person. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget, at that Dan Fogelberg show, Dan was just starting to break. And I'll never forget, Irving said to me that day, and this is the first time I had met Irving in person, and he said, and he was best friends. They both grew up together in, I think, Peoria. And he said, this guy is going to be selling out arenas and amphitheaters in the next year. He was a club act then. Mm-hmm. And of course he did. I always believed everything Irving ever said since then, because he was so right about the late and great Dan Fogelberg.
Great. So what have we not covered? Anything? Well, let's talk about your book. Your book is...
Yeah,
how far along are you? It sounds like you're pretty far along.
I never realized writing an autobiography takes a long time.
Oh,
if you want
tell
to make
me about
it. Yeah, I never wanted to do an autobiography. First of all, they don't do that well. I mean, the biggest autobiography that's done the best has been Bill Graham's book. And even that didn't sell that well. And so I never wanted to do an autobiography. And one day, about 3 years ago, my son, Zachary, who's just 24, 25, one day he said, Dad, why don't you write an autobiography about your life? Because you've had such an interesting life. And I said, Zach, nobody cares about my life. He said, well, let me tell you, I care because when you're gone, I want my kids and grandkids to hear about you. And the only way they can hear about you is my stories, but autobiography. And I got a hold of a guy I've been friends with for 35 years named Brett Saunders, who's been the morning guy at KBCO, is a wonderful writer and knows music as well as anybody, and has been around most of my career. And we've been writing it together. And by the way, it's not going to be one of them where they don't put his name. He's going to get full credit. It's going to be my autobiography written by myself and Brett Saunders. And we've had about 17 hours of tapes. Mm-hmm. We're into about chapter 4 out of 12. We have all the chapters planned. And we've gone through about 10 working titles. And I think we came up with a good one about 2 months ago. And I think, that could change when the book's done and ready to come out. Some publishers can say, well, this could be better. But the working title we have now, and I think it's a good one, it's called From Brooklyn to Boulder, the Saga of a Rock Promoter. And I think that's really sort of cool because I was born and raised in Brooklyn and came to Boulder, which changed my life. And I think it's a pretty good title. But Brett Saunders has done a great job. We meet every Sunday for about 2 hours. We have about 19 hours of tapes. And we're into about chapter 4 out of 11 chapters.
Yeah. So, you use the word autobiography. When I was wanting to do what I did, I wanted to tell the story of the industry that started from, there was just an AT&T, there wasn't internet, there weren't mobile phones, to how we got to today, surrounded by the people like the Phil Anschutz of the world and kind of all the people we came across. We have our own set of crazy characters that kind of helped all this happen. Some were really bad. Some were really, heroes. So the story I told is more as me being the storyteller, but my story is kind of told through this much bigger story that, that so many people were part of. And I wanted to capture it for all of those people because, I know hundreds and thousands of people who gave their life to creating this industry, yet the story was like getting just lost. No one really told it because of all the chaos that happened and the destruction that took place in the 2000s, including Quest and many others. So, it was a struggle though. How do you tell the big story? How do you put yourself in the story? When do you put yourself in it? But the professionals we talked to said, you can't do it. It won't work. This and that. But
they just
but we got our first 4 reviews came in. They were all real positive, and the people in the industry certainly are, getting a lot of feedback that people are really excited because it's really the story of so many people, and it kind of puts for their kids and their grandchildren and their, the people in their lives. It's like, okay, I might have played a small role in this big story, but now you know what I was doing in all those crazy, times. So it was
Well, I'm
rewarding
having
to
the
do
time
it.
of my life writing this book with Brett. I mean, and I've been having him call and talk to some of my friends to verify to myself that my memory's right. He's been calling a lot of my old time friends to verify some of my stories, not because I was lying to them, but because sometimes my memory's not that great. And I've been surprised how much I can remember.
And plus, your memory of something could be very accurate from your point of view, 10, 20, 30 years going by, but other people were experiencing the story from a different vantage point. So their memory might be different because the story as it played out to them wasn't the same story. So, as I was going through this, I would have people who were part of stories read a part of the book, and they'd say, well, let me tell you how this looked from my perspective, or let me tell you what was happening behind the scenes on the other end of that deal. And boy, when you start uncovering that, it gets that much more rewarding.
One of the great tidbits, and I talked about it in the book whenever it gets done. I booked this guy named J.J. Cale when he was first getting enrolled. If you know anything about John Cale's his real name, he was actually named J.J. Cale. There's a little trivia here. His real name is John Cale. But when he signed with Denny Cordell and Shelter Records, there was already a John Cale from Velvet Underground. So you can't have this, in AFM, you can't have the same name as somebody else. So actually, Denny Cordell named him J.J. Cale. And of course, that stuck. But I'll never forget. So I was working with Faye then, and I booked him a bunch, and he became real big in Colorado, and Denver, and Boulder. If you know anything about John Cale, JJ, he wrote some great songs, had hits. Eric Clapton, a couple of songs he wrote. It was After Midnight and Crazy Mama he wrote.
Wow.
And made all this great money as a writer. Only worked, he was very shy and really didn't like to work live. And, but he usually went out once a year. He once told me he went out to pay his income taxes. And he was the greatest. I was the biggest fan of his. And one of the greatest songwriters I think that I've ever grew up, and was really didn't like to play, but he went out, and I loved him, and his audience loved him. And one of the great stories, I'll never forget. I had J.J. Cale. This is like the fourth time he played for me at Ebbets Field, my club. And he was the headliner, and he was selling a lot of tickets. And the opening act, this is such a great story. The opening act was a young guy who was huge in England, but just getting started in the U.S., named Leo Sayer.
Oh, yeah.
And in those days,
Sayer.
you could put any act you wanted on with the headliner. And today, you can't do that. The headliner, his agent and the manager will call and say, we want to hear their music. But nobody cared in those days. And so I put Leo Sayer on to open J.J. Cale at Ebbets Field, my club. And the stage was the smallest stage in the world. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. Leo Sayer was already a big star in London, in England. And he had all these big marshals, and he came out and did a sound check in the afternoon, and it filled up the whole stage. And then John Cale came walking in about 5 o'clock to do his little, and he would come in his Cadillac with his band with a hitch behind it. And he was so what's the word? I mean, he just was so easy to deal with. And I'll never forget, he walked into Ebbets Field near the headliner had just done their sound check, and it filled up the whole stage. Now, 99 out of 100 artists, the headliner would walk in and say, get rid of that stuff. Maybe he shouldn't open. And I'll never forget, Cale looked at me and said, well, I guess we'll have to work around this. And he didn't. He put his little amplifiers behind Leo Sayer, the opener. And you couldn't even see him, but Cale didn't care. And he set up behind, you could hardly see him. And he was fine with that. Didn't change the lights, didn't do anything. But if you ever saw him, and he rest in peace, the songs he wrote were just mind-blowing. And the second great J.J. Cale story is, so I was working with Faye then, and I said, this guy J.J. Cale's come really, really great. big in Colorado, in Denver and Boulder. And so I convinced Barry to put him on. I can't remember, somebody at the Pepsi, no, in Pepsi, I think it was before that. I can't remember who he opened for because he was selling a lot of tickets. So Barry didn't really know who he was. And so I had him play, and we gave him like a lot of money in those days as the opener, like $10,000. I can't remember. I think it was that. And so Faye was there. It was his show. I was there with him. Of course, I was vice president of Fayline then. And Cale came out there, and I convinced Barry to give him a lot of money because it was a one-off. And I said, he'll sell some tickets. And he did. And I'll never forget. So Cale plays for like 35 minutes and walks off stage. And Barry is fuming. He said, you convinced me to play this guy, and he's supposed to do 60 minutes. He did 35. I'm going to give him a piece of my mind. I said, Barry, it won't make a difference. But I said, yeah, come on in here. So he went to Cale's dressing room after he had finished 35 out of 60. And Barry was like so pissed off. And Barry said, I'll never forget, this is the funniest, greatest story. He didn't know John Cale. I did real well. And he walked in and says, my partner here, Chuck Morris, convinced me all this money. You're supposed to play 60 minutes. You played 35 goddamn minutes. And I gave you all this money. And Cale looked at Barry and said, Barry, I just don't like to play. And I'd never seen in all my years with Faye, with Barry, and, best man at my wedding, best friends. I never saw Barry speechless, ever there or since. He couldn't respond to that. And Barry, who loved, turned around, walked out. He couldn't say, because Barry, I just don't like to play. And Barry couldn't come up with any. Why, it was the funniest thing. And only Cale would say that. And he meant it.
Yeah. Well, this has been a treat for me.
Oh, a treat for me too.
And I think it's great that you'll have this to share with your grandchildren, great-grandchildren down the road. And
I already have four grandchildren.
Oh, yeah. So I've got a few myself.
Yeah.
So, this podcast all around Colorado Innovators want to highlight the people who do things special and do things special in a way that has made Colorado what it is today and are setting a table for the future Colorado. And boy, am I glad that your daughter suggested you, because this is such a great story and one that people
by the way,
need
if
to know.
any of my facts are wrong, I apologize.
Right. It's a podcast.
I'm not trying to name drop or do this or that, but sometimes I can forget what year or what I did, but my intention has always been to tell everybody the memory I have.
This is about what you remember, not exactly what happened. So, we really want to hear from you, at least me. I should talk to myself. I just love to hear from the person, kind of their journey and what it was all about and how they got from one spot to another and what they had to overcome along the way. And this has just been a fantastic
My favorite
one.
line is people, if they talk about their stories in the 70s in the music business, they're probably lying because they were too screwed up to remember anyway.
Yeah, I love it.
But,
great. Well, thank you.
I'll end by that, huh?
All right.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Yeah, lots of fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe on your listening platform. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Courtney Caruso with support from Kendall Weinberg, Emily Reed, and Gibson Siegert.